Welcome, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. We want to start off, obviously we will introduce the secretary, but I'd like to start off by introducing our panel first. We're going to try to get through as many things as quickly as possible because we'd love to get the audience to be able to get some questions in during our session, our conversation with the former Secretary of State. I'd like to start, first of all, by saying we have a panel that represents the globe, around the world, really an extraordinary group of people. It's going to be very brief, however, just so we can squeeze in as much as possible. I'd like to start off with our first panelist, Chadia Meouchi. Chadia. She is managing partner, Chadia. She is managing partner of Badri and Salam El Chadia law firm. It is the oldest regional law firm offices in Lebanon and Qatar. She is co-founder of the Middle East Leadership Initiative and a 2008 Henry Crown Fellow. And we asked each one of them what they wanted to do, their second act or their previous act. She says she wanted to be a spy like one of the James Bond girls. Kathleen Gahn. She is the Chief Financial and Risk Officer for Global Commercial Banking, HSBC. She's a 2008 Henry Crown Fellow of the Aspen Institute based in Hong Kong. And she has worked in more than 25 countries, 50 cities, and she wanted to be a ballerina. Welcome. Next at our panel, Ali Mufuruki, that is. He is co-founder of the Africa Leadership Initiative at the Aspen Institute. And he is, has a BS in mechanical engineering and design. He and his 4 children live in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. He is a 2001 Henry Crown Fellow, and he wanted to be a boxer. Ali, welcome. Gigi Porras. She is the former Minister of Commerce and Industry in Panama. She is a fellow of the Central America Leadership Initiative. And she always wanted to be, she says, a singer, a dancer like Madonna, she says, the material girl. That is Gigi for you. Thank you to our panel. Now, when I was asked to moderate this panel with Secretary Albright, I was certainly honored. I had a chance to speak with her and see her in action in the Clinton years, traveling to Europe and Africa, Latin America. And she was so gracious and kind. We had breakfast this morning, so I learned a lot of other things about her. One of the things that I asked her this morning was, what should I address you? Should it be Dr. Albright, Madam Secretary? And she simply said, Madeleine, as in Cher or Madonna or Beyonce, somebody who needs no last name. So. She's very modest, but I do want to go over her resume, her bio briefly, because it does give us a sense of the context of this conversation and what she brings to the table. I promise I will get back to some of the things that I learned during breakfast as well. Madeleine Albright is currently chair of the Albright Stonebridge Group. It is a global strategy firm. She is also chair of Albright Capital Management, an investment advisory firm focused on emerging markets. She is chair of the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. And as we all know, she made history as the 67th Secretary of State for the United States, as the first female to hold this position. She was the highest ranking woman in the history of US government in 1997. As Secretary of State, she reinforced America's alliances, advocated for democracy and human rights, promoted American trade, bound business, labor, and environmental standards abroad. From 1993 to 1997, Dr. Albright served as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, was a member of the President's Cabinet, and always those who were impressed with her, there was an ongoing campaign for her to run as U.S. President. We know she cannot do that, being born in Czechoslovakia, but there was always a campaign for her to actually rise to that occasion. She currently today is professor in the practice of diplomacy at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. She serves on numerous boards, the U.S. Department of Defense's Defense Policy Board, Council on Foreign Relations, the Aspen Institute, of course, the Center for American Progress. She is the author of 4 New York Times bestsellers And the last time she was at the White House, she was with President Obama receiving the nation's highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So here's what I learned at breakfast. Right around the corner from where she lives, her neighbor is the current Secretary of State, John Kerry. Her BFF, should come as no surprise, Hillary Clinton. She has 3 daughters, 2 who are twins. Her youngest one, Katie, is here in the audience. And I asked her about a report where she said she could leg press 400 pounds. I said, is this true? She said, absolutely not. 450. She is not someone to be messed with. I would like to welcome Madeleine, former Secretary of State, to our panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Suzanne, I want to thank you for telling everybody who I am, because not everybody always knows. I had, not long ago, was coming back from China, and Chicago was the first port of entry, and I was there getting undressed for the security people, and I put my stuff down on the conveyor belt, and the lady behind me said, so where'd you get all those screw-top bottles? My bottles all leak. I said, well, at the Container Store. And then I was going through the magnetometer, and the TSA guard looked at me and he said, oh my God, it's you. He said, I'm from Bosnia, and we all love you in Bosnia, and if it weren't for you, there wouldn't be a Bosnia, and you're welcome in Bosnia, and can I have my picture taken with you? So we stopped the whole line. I have a picture taken. I go back to get my stuff, and the lady of the screw-top bottle says, so what exactly happened here? I said, well, I used to be Secretary of State, and she said, of Bosnia, so...
Oh, no! Well, we know you here. I'm going to kick off the questioning. Two questions, one funny, one serious. But tell us about your pin, because you would not give that away this morning, which pin you're wearing today for this occasion.
Well, I am now known for my pins as a new tool of diplomacy. And so this is practicing cultural diplomacy. This is a Native American pin made by the Zunis, and I really thought that it was appropriate here in the West, where I am. I grew up in Denver, so I'm very comfortable at home and very glad to sport this.
Yeah. Let's kick off the conversation. I want to ask you, as an immigrant, as somebody who comes from a family who survived the Holocaust, as someone who has a great deal of pride in this country, this is a war-weary place with wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Egypt. What do you believe is the role right now of the United States in its position in the globe?
Well, I don't want to compete with David, but I grew up, was raised a Catholic, married an Episcopalian, and found out I was Jewish. Therefore, guilt is one of my major actors. I feel I did come here as a child at age 11, and my father was a Czechoslovak diplomat, and we spent the war in England and then went back to Czechoslovakia, then came to the United States when the communists took over Czechoslovakia. And so for me, without insulting any of the wonderful foreigners that are here, for me, the biggest thing that ever happened in my life was coming to America and becoming an American. And I really felt in my own life story that when the U.S. wasn't present, bad things happened. As somebody who was born, as I said, in Czechoslovakia, Munich was the most outrageous thing that happened when the British and French sold the country, having made a deal with the Germans and Italians. They basically sold Czechoslovakia down the river, and the United States wasn't there. Then, during World War II, when the Americans came in, I was a little girl in England, you could see the American soldiers, and you could feel that something different was going to happen. Then, when as a result of agreements made during World War II, the Americans did not liberate Czechoslovakia, even though General Patton was kind of 45 miles in, and the Soviets, quote, liberated the country, terrible things happened. The Iron Curtain came down. So for me, the theme always has been, what is America's role? And so I believe in an active American role. We have responsibilities in the world. I believe in the goodness of American power, and so I want to see us active. But I think it's very important that whatever we do be in partnership with others. And when I was at the UN, President Clinton said it first, but I said this so often, it all became identified with me, that we are the indispensable nation. And there is nothing in the word indispensable that says alone. It just says we need to be engaged. And so I feel very strongly that the U.S. needs to be actively engaged in the international community, trying to figure out how to deal with the problems that we're going to be talking about.
All right. Chadia, if you'd like to start with your first question.
Yes. So I also feel strongly that the US should be highly engaged in the international community. I also think they should be very well engaged. So my question is that the US has been financing nearly for the last 10 years, every year, billions of dollars, close to $30 billion every year on the fight against terrorism and specifically against Al-Qaeda and similar movements. So at the same time, it's one of its strong allies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, is financing in similar amounts, billions of dollars every year, madrasas and schools and mosques that propagate the fundamentalist Islam ideologies that then lead to that find themselves in some of these movements like Al-Qaeda. So my question is, what do you think the US ought to do about this, and what do you think it will do about this in the coming years?
Well, I think that it points up the complications of foreign policy in the 21st century. I do think that the United States needs to fight terrorism. I happen to believe that the statement about war on terrorism was a real mistake, because what happened, we got involved in this after 9/11, and the people who hit the towers in New York were murderers, plain and simple. And by talking about a war on terrorism, we made them warriors in their own societies and glorified a lot about it. So I think that that has been a mistake, and I'm very appreciative of the way that the Obama administration is now dealing with terrorism as a whole. I do think also that the Saudis have a mixed record on a number of different issues. I think there are groups that do exactly what you're talking about, but also, and this is the hard part about actually being involved in decision making for the United States government, is that we need the Saudis in a number of different places. We need to privately tell them things that we do not like that they're doing in terms of their way they treat women and a number of other issues. But the Saudis are important friends of the United States and important in terms of trying to get some kind of stability in the Middle East. But when you state it the way you did, it does seem completely contradictory. But when you actually get into these areas, they're a little bit more gray.
Thank you. Kathleen?
Yeah. So a report by the National Intelligence Council predicts that the United States may lose its superpower status by 2030. So my question is, how is U.S. dealing with the possibility that it may no longer be number one global power one day? And what is Washington doing to shape its policy strategically while it is still number one today, so that it can set the rules and framework for the next number one, which potentially could be China?
It's very interesting that it goes back to something I said before in the question that you asked, how do you see the United States' role? And I think, this may surprise you, but I think many, many Americans do not want to be the superpower. Many Americans, we like to be number one in sports and things, but I do think that there is not this, we are not an imperialist power. We don't like the idea that we have certain responsibilities. And one of the reasons that President Clinton and I started talking about indispensable was to kind of go against that feeling that Americans have. We've got a big country, we don't have to worry about others. So I think that this would not be a great shock. I think the issue really comes down to the following thing. The way that the world looks today, it can't operate with just a superpower. It needs to have partners. There needs to be, I know Americans don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables and it ends in an ism. But basically it means partnership. And so I think many Americans would like to see another, well, China and other countries really play a larger role. That's the partnership part. And I also think the issue is something different, which is how to and this is part of what the dialogue is with the Chinese today, is how do you get the Chinese to not just do what we heard at the last panel about going into some country and taking their resources and building them a road, but to be co-responsible for a lot of the issues that are out there, whether it's dealing with terrorism, nuclear proliferation, energy and environment issues, the gap between the rich and the poor. So I think that's more where Americans would like to see things go.
Thank you. Thank you. Ali.
Madam Secretary,
You speak up a
the
little.
United States for many decades, if not centuries, has been seen, especially by young emerging democracies like those in Africa where I come from, as a model of freedom, as a model of opportunity, as a model of even justice. And many of our countries have been looking at the United States model as one that they could emulate for themselves as we learn to become democratic states. However, the recent shooting of an unarmed 17-year-old in Florida recently, and the subsequent acquittal of his killer by an all-white jury, kind of exposed, I think, not just to us, but I'm sure also to the United States, that the battle against racism is far from won 50 years after that hopeful speech by Martin Luther King. Now, we ask ourselves, why should we still continue looking at the United States as a model of a society we should emulate?
I think that what happened, and I am not a lawyer, I am appalled by what happened in that trial. I probably should keep my mouth shut on it because it's not my business, but I do think that it was a tragedy in every single way. I think what is great about America is that there still are more possibilities for people to have, as David was saying, pursuit of happiness, and a way for people. You know, there are not a lot of countries where somebody who's an immigrant ends up as Secretary of State, or that has a black president when we are primarily a mixed country. And so there are many, many fabulous things about us. But I think what is most interesting about us is we are examining what just happened. What happened? Why did it happen? What can we do to make it different? And it is a constant kind of dialogue that goes on. I think that I am deeply troubled by the decision. I am deeply troubled by what is not so latent racism, but I do believe that this country is trying to figure it out. And if we are a model, it is that we question ourselves. We do have a system of government that, when it works properly, really does have checks and balances and tries to figure out the answers. And I do believe, I am a very proud American, and I do believe that we're going to figure this one out. But it is a mortifying and horrible thing, I think, that happened. I speak for myself in this.
If I could just follow, because I know you and I discussed this briefly over breakfast, what do you think of the president's role, President Obama uniquely as being the first African-American president?
I think the president every president has a very difficult job at a time when there is a moral crisis or some terrible accident or kind of the leader in charge of various things. I find President Obama a remarkable figure in many ways. I told you this, I think I told you this at breakfast, when I obviously was for Hillary Clinton. And when I was here just before the Democratic Convention, I listened to Barack Obama's, Dreams of My Father, because he read it. And I thought, what an amazing story this man has, and what an amazing country, and I hoped he'd get elected. I worked very hard for his election, and I thought, what an amazing story he has, and how he has pulled his life together in a number of different ways. And so I think that I thought his speech was fantastic. I'm very glad he gave it. I think he has a unique role to play, both as a president and as the first African-American president. And I think that we should all reread the speech, because I think it was very carefully delivered, very carefully thought out. And I think it was remarkable. I really do. I think it was the right thing to do.
All right, thank you. Gigi.
Well, last but not least, we are yet so close but so apart between the U.S. and Central America. When is Central America going to be in the U.S. agenda far beyond the issues on border control, far beyond drugs, trafficking, immigrations, money laundering? What happened to the dreams of pathways to prosperity and all that?
Well, I have to say this is one of the great difficulties of American foreign policy is trying to have the right relationship, the correct relationship with all of Latin America. I can tell you from my own experience, you're damned if you do or damned if you don't. We either are not paying attention to you for whatever reason, and you say exactly what you just said, or we're paying too much attention, and you're saying, why are you meddling in our affairs? I think that it is very important that we see the strength of the Americas. I have to tell you, the most revolutionary thing I did while I was in the State Department was make sure that Canada was in the Western Hemisphere. Okay. According to the State Department, just so you know, according to the State Department, Canada was in Europe.
Okay.
And so I actually thought it is in the Western Hemisphere. It should be in the Western Hemisphere. And the reason that I did it was that I so believe in the strength of the Americas and operating together and understanding that we are linked by our desires for democracy and good economic life. So, but part of the problem is you, because what I said is absolutely true. I mean, I went to many meetings with Central American foreign ministers, and sometimes they'd say, leave us alone. Yes. And other times, why haven't you been here more often? So that is the problem. But I think generally we have to figure out what our real relationship is in this hemisphere and recognize the strength that we have if we operate as democracies with liberal economic systems.
And I guess first understanding if we want to be together as a region, I guess.
I think that is also part of it. You guys have to like each other.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So I like the way this is moving along. I think we get a second more round with our questioners if we can kind of keep the pace there, and then we can get our audience to start participating. So Chadia.
Yeah, so my second question is one that is very deep into my heart as an Arab, and it's, I think, very important for Arabs, Israelis, Americans, and its perception of America in the Middle East and worldwide. So it's on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And my question is, what is the US planning to do about this? Taking into consideration two things specifically. So first, the increasing Palestinian population. Right now you have 20% Palestinians in Israel, within Israel. And if you take West Bank, Gaza, and Israel, you're at nearly half population. So, and that's increasing immensely. And then the second issue that to take into consideration is all the Arab risings that have been happening and the power of numbers. And taking into consideration these two facts, demographics, power, and Arab risings, what are you planning to do about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to resolve it?
Well, I have to say, Secretary Kerry is doing an incredible job trying to deal with an issue that has been out there for a long time. All of us that have been in positions of either ambassadors or secretaries of state know that this is an essential issue that has to be dealt with. I have to say it is very, very complicated and difficult. And I think that as far as I'm concerned, the United States needs to be very supportive of a two-state solution, very much for the reasons that you have stated. But ultimately, the United States cannot dictate the terms. The United States can set the table or bring them to the table, but it's the parties that have to make the decision. I believe that the issue has to be solved for its own purposes, partially of what you have said. And I have to say, when I first became secretary and I went to the region and I drove from Jerusalem to Ramallah and saw what was going on, I thought what has to happen is the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people have to be recognized. And I think that is the direction in which Secretary Kerry is leading the discussions. But ultimately, we have to recognize, as important as it is on its own, it is not the only problem in the Middle East. And I've always said that everybody says if you just solve that problem, everything else would be all right. I don't believe that. I think there are other issues that are going on that are very complicated, and I will just state it very briefly in this way. Last winter, I was having a public discussion with an Arab, and I said, well, we can't call it the Arab Spring anymore because it's the winter. And so we call it the Arab Awakening. And he said, that is an outrage. The Arabs have not been asleep all this time. And I said, so what would you call it? And he said, Arab troubles. And I said, what about Arab opportunities? So in those four kind of thoughts, it shows what a complicated situation is going on. And I do think that the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian issue will help, but it will not solve everything. And a lot of it has to do with some of the discussions from the previous panel in terms of what is it people want, how many issues are economic, how many are political, are these real countries? A lot of them, President Clinton read a lot himself, and he told us to read a lot of books. One he told me to read was called The Peace to End All Peace by an American historian, David Fromkin, that describes the creation of the modern Middle East after World War I. These are the countries that were set up. The short version of the book is the Middle East was set up as a result of the British and French bureaucracies lying to each other. So we are dealing with all of that. And so those two issues go on together.
All right, thank you. Kathleen.
Yeah, so I want to explore the concept of partnership a little bit further, in relation to the first question I asked earlier on. In your opinion, is the Obama pivot to Asia policy working effectively? Is it really trying to help strengthen alliances and deepen partnerships? Or is it a containment strategy towards China? And how is that constructive towards the relationship between China and the US?
I think that whoever said the word pivot first probably should not be there, but because it's really a rebalancing. And I think that people need to understand the United States is not a monogamous power. We are both Atlantic and Pacific. And we can love Europe and Asia at the same time. And so
This is getting personal.
yeah, and I think the thing that is very clear is we have very strong relations in the Pacific, and we have allies in the Pacific, the Japanese and the South Koreans, and we have very strong interest in the Pacific. It has not been it hasn't been that simple, I think, to explain not only to Americans, but also to the countries in the Pacific, and it's been difficult to explain to the Europeans, who are saying, you've left us. And as a European myself, I go there and I say, okay, stop whining. You guys used to be the problem. You're now the solution. Help us in this. But if you, we were talking about the Western, in most American classrooms, there is this Western hemisphere in the middle and these two flaps on either side. And when I traveled as secretary, I would always insist in classrooms that people bring me a globe to say most of the people in the world live on the other side of the globe. And it is an interest of the United States. So I think that it makes sense for the rebalancing. I do not think it's containment of China, although I think there are some Chinese who believe it and some Americans who would like to see it. But I think that President Obama and his team are trying very hard to show that it's an area that is very important to us for partnership and strategic and economic cooperation.
All right, thank you. Ali.
You will agree with me that we in Africa don't have a very long history of practicing democracy. I think there are few, if any, countries in Africa that have been living under democratic rule for more than 20 years. We still have all forms of dictatorships, but luckily we have been making lots of progress there. And largely due to the encouragement we have received from our Western friends, the United States being one of the most prominent ones. And democracy is something that you have to believe in because the results of using it or practicing it are not instant. You don't necessarily harvest the fruits of democracy by having an election once or even twice. Now, whenever we are challenged in a short history of practicing democracy, we kind of struggled to fix these things because our institutions are still very fragile and weak. And we look to you, to the West and to the United States for leadership and advice and guidance. Now, recently, when the Egyptian government of Mohamed Morsi was thrown out of office by what we in Africa consider a coup, the African Union moved very quickly to impose sanctions. As a matter of fact, within 24 hours, it imposed sanctions on that regime because it has a principle of rejecting any form of violence being used as a way of removing from office a democratically elected government. What has surprised us, however, is the deafening silence of the West about this whole issue, and especially in the United States, and with some even suggesting that some kind of new form of democratic coup may have taken place in Egypt. Others saying what happened in Egypt doesn't meet our definition of a coup. Now, we beginning to get confused in Africa. And what the hell is going on? Should we, the next time we don't like a president in Tanzania, just go on the streets and make a lot of noise, get coverage from Al Jazeera and CNN, have that person removed, and that's the new kind of democracy we should be pursuing, and you're going to tolerate that? So I would like you to answer that.
Well, I think that, first of all, on the first part of your question in terms of democracy, democracy is not an event. Democracy is a process, and many countries are still learning it, including our own. And we are imperfect in that ourselves. I am chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute, and we, in fact, are around the world helping people to understand the nuts and bolts of democracy, not imposing democracy, which is an oxymoron, but in terms of just helping in a number of different ways. We could talk more about that. I think that the issue in Egypt is complicated by reality, if I could say that. Part of and it goes, we've had questions about what is the role of the United States, what is the leverage the United States has. And I teach a course at Georgetown. I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want, that's all it is. So what are the tools? And the course I teach is called the National Security Toolbox. And the truth is that there are not a lot of tools in it in terms of how you exert leverage, how you try to influence a country to behave in a particular way. There's diplomacy, bilateral and multilateral. There are the economic tools, the carrots, which are aid and trade, and the sticks, which are sanctions. Then there's the threat of the use of force, intelligence, and law enforcement. That's it. There is nothing easier, if I could say that, than cutting off everything. It's hard to resurrect it in many different ways. And I think that there is a very complicated linguistic explanation for whatever the administration is saying. But the problem is the following, is if we cut off all assistance, which is what happens if you declare it a coup, we will not have any influence whatsoever. And the question is how to use that tool in a way to try to bring about some change in Egypt to make sure that the relationship between Israel and Egypt stays intact, because it goes to your point. And there's something else that I think is worth understanding that is probably inside baseball, but for Americans that follow the government. One of the hard parts is when Congress has a law that makes the administration behave in some automatic way. And that is the law, is that if it's declared a coup, then you have to cut off all assistance. And so they're trying to figure out how to use a little bit of nuance in terms of having some influence still in Egypt. But the Egyptian situation is incredibly complicated, difficult because Morsi was elected, and then also partially because the Muslim Brotherhood had been outlawed, gained strength in that, was the only organization that worked, and other kind of democratic channels never got off the ground because of the policies there. But you've asked a very tough question, and all of you have asked tough questions to which there is no, one of the things about trying to explain foreign policy is it doesn't come in very clean, perfect boxes. which is why I talk about, there are always these arguments as to whether America's foreign policy is idealistic or realistic. And I always have said that's a false dichotomy, mainly because I don't know what I am, an idealistic realist or a realistic idealist. And so I talk about the doability doctrine. What is it that we can do? Where can we make a difference? How can the United States act in conjunction with others? What is our influence? And all of you are really asking that particular question.
And Gigi, I'm going to ask you to, I don't mean to cut you short, but if you can be quick, we're going to still try to get a couple of questions from the audience.
I want to give her the spot on this one. It's about women issues. You've said that women issues are issues of life and death. They go from the right to have an education to rape being a war weapon. And yet, there are some women and some of us, we don't want to step forward and get involved and be part of the decision makers to table the issues in the agenda. Is there kind of a hidden agenda that really wants to keep us away of the decision makings on life and death issues? Why are we not participating? What's going on?
Well, I actually do believe that there is sort of an agenda that there's plenty of room in the world, with apologies to many people here, there's plenty of room in the world for mediocre men. There is no room for mediocre women. And therefore, but I do think that there are those in some countries that do not want to see women in power. But I also think we have to take responsibility for ourselves, and that is that there are many discussions going on about the role of women, and my sense is that women should be allowed to choose what they want to do. The word for women generally is choice. We need to have choice in the way we run our lives and in everything about it. And so, but I do think that there has been some progress. You pointed out that my youngest daughter's here. Her daughter, my youngest grandchild, said to her, so this was about 3 years ago, she said to her, so what's the big deal about Grandma Maddie being Secretary of State? Only girls are Secretary of State.
I know we're running out of time. If we can take a couple of questions from the audience, please. I know that people are have microphones.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Thank you for
make it brief.
thank you for conversation. It's very inspiring. But I think that it will be incomplete if we don't bring an issue of Russia to the table. Especially the President Obama bright idea was to reload the relationship with Russia. It looks like it didn't work really, and now Russia is actually exposing more and more pressure on the neighboring countries. And now this issue with Snowden, and actually what do you think the State Department should do about it? Thank you.
Well, I used to be known as a Soviet expert. I also have a library. When I look at it, I thought, well, this is more like archaeology. And then I went back and I looked at my library. There is a lot that is similar in terms of the way that Russia has behaved over the years. And I do think that the United States would like to have a partnership relationship with Russia. However, it takes two to reset. And I think that part of the issue is that the Russians are going through an identity crisis of their own, having been the other superpower. And now I have been part of lots of surveys about Russia. And I remember going there in '91, and the people in Russia were embarrassed. They would say, we've caused so much trouble, and yet they had an identity issue, and they'd say, now we're just Bangladesh with missiles. And so part of what has happened is this identity crisis, and what I find really, really depressing, and it goes to discussions of the Middle East, is the role that Russia is playing in what is going on in Syria. And it is not one where there is a sense that they can be partners in bringing peace and stability, but much too much involved with their own image at the time, at this time. And I think that the U.S. can try as hard as it wants to, but if President Putin has different views, it is very difficult as he tries to burnish his image and that of Russia.
Audience member over here, please.
Is there a doability doctrine to settle the immigration problem in the United States?
I have to, I am obviously very prejudiced about this. I am an immigrant, and a very grateful immigrant. And One of the things that I enjoyed doing the most when I was a Secretary of State was going to naturalization ceremonies and renewing my own vows and watching how many people want to come to the United States and how honored they are to become American citizens. And as I hand out their naturalization certificate, I say, this is the most important piece of paper you will ever have. I have exactly the same one. Keep it safe. I think we are cutting off our nose to spite our face to not have a generous, comprehensive immigration bill. I have to tell you this. I was just in Jordan, where I was there for the National Democratic Institute. I was taken to the Syrian refugee camp. And I had also, same one that Secretary Kerry went to, and I also was told that there are Palestinian refugees and Iraqi refugees and Syrian refugees. The equivalent would be if the United States had 40 million refugees. And we're asking Jordan to deal with this. We can't even deal with 11 million undocumented workers. I do believe that the United States is an exceptional country, but we can't ask that exceptions be made for us, whether it is how to treat African Americans and what happened on that particular trial, what happens in terms of keeping our doors open for those who want to come and work here and participate in the American dream. We can't talk about our role if we can't figure out how to be the country of diversity and opportunity and the possibility of the pursuit of happiness.